Okay, so this video is going to show you in real time how to answer a GCSE AQA Sociology paper. Exam technique is crucial for this exam, so we're going to go through exactly how to do each question, how to read the question in the exam, how to plan your answer, and then I'll write an example for you in exam conditions. I'm going to be doing the exam paper from the back, so I will be doing the ones that are the high tariff questions first. That's the questions that are worth the most marks, so hopefully I'll put the most effort into gaining the most marks, and if I make any mistakes with my timings, it will only affect the short answer questions, not the long answer questions. I'm going to be doing just one section of a paper, which is why I've given myself 50 minutes. The real papers, paper 1, you will have families and education, and paper 2 you'll have crime and deviance and social stratification. Each exam will be 1 hour and 45 minutes, and each exam will have 2 sections. So you'll do section 1 in 50 minutes exactly the way I show you. You'll then do a second section in another 50 minutes exactly the way I show you. Following that, you'll have 5 minutes at the end to check over your work, and it'll be exactly the same skills that you need for paper 2. I'm going to be using an education section. It is, as you can see, an assessment that we used in term 1, so this may be familiar to some of the people watching the video. And you will also notice that some of the questions enable me to repeat the points that I use, but that is absolutely fine because that's the way it works in the real exam. You might find this assessment doesn't quite cover a massive range of things in the way that a real exam would, but our focus today is on the exam technique and how we do that. So that's what I'm going to focus on. I've given myself 50 minutes. You can see the stopwatch in the corner there. And when I press play, I will start. Good luck to me. Good luck to everybody. Here we go. Okay, I'm going to start then by going to the last question, question 11, an essay question. To discuss to what extent independent schools are a valuable part of the education system. So this is a how much they are, and I'm going to start by then writing out a clear definition of what an independent school is, because that is my key term. Independent schools select students by ability and parents pay a fee. And are they valuable? So I need to give a clear answer, yes or no. I'm going to say no. Okay, so I've said no. Now let's see about how I can plan my answer. I need it maybe a point for and a point against. Well, they get good results, okay, on the one hand, but on the other hand, not everybody benefits from those results. Not everyone can go, so there's no meritocracy. And I'm also going to argue that they're not very good for social cohesion because working class students tend not to be able to go to them. I want to try and include lots of good key terms as I can, if I can as well. So I've put there meritocracy. I'm also going to write things such as role allocation would be a good thing for me to include as I go through. Maybe I can also write about social mobility, and maybe I could write about secondary socialization and the hidden curriculum. Okay, I've taken a couple of minutes already just planning my answer and writing my introduction, but that's going to help me write a good answer. So, independent schools get good results. Okay, so I've done a positive. I now need to contradict that positive by doing a however. Okay, let's move on to discussing the lack of social mobility and meritocracy. That's how I'm arguing, not just making points. Change that. Meritocracy requires. Well, I've done that. I'm now going to mention social mobility next. Just throw in a scribe status and achieve status as well, just for fun. Okay, and my last point was then about social cohesion. And I need to argue independent schools go against this. Now I need a conclusion. My conclusion should sum up the points I've made so far, and it should then give my overall answer, which is they are not that valuable. Notice I'm constantly stretching out my hand whenever I stop for my brain to think. And I'm going to use the words for the question in my conclusion. So let's check I have covered social mobility, secondary socialisation, curriculum, done that. To what extent are they valuable? So let's use those exact words in my conclusion. They therefore have limited value to the education system. They have some, but not very much. So you can see there my overall essay. I defined my key terms in the opening. I also defined what the question was, and I gave my overall answer. I then had 1.4, which was their results, and I tried to use some key terms to back that up in that paragraph, but then I also argued against it. I then moved on to 2 paragraphs that were going against the value of independent schools, each of which again included lots of sociological concept as I went, and also some examples of what I was talking about. And then I moved into my second point there that was negative about secondary socialisation through the hidden curriculum in order to create social cohesion and bind community together. They work in teams one another. I could have maybe built on that example a little bit more, and then I gave my conclusion where I summed up all the points that I wanted to make, and I've done all of that in under 12 minutes, which was the time that I had. Let's just improve this slightly, where they learn to work in teams with one another. Let's go for e.g. in PE and sport. Okay, coming up to 12 minutes. Let's go back to the previous question 10 this time. I'll just wait for my 12 minutes to go, and then I'll be bang on time. Discuss how far sociologists agree. Again, this is a how far they agree. The main function of the education system is to serve the needs of the economy. So I've got one function there, which is to serve the needs of the economy. Okay, so I'm going to write about that as my main point. I'm going to maybe write about Parsons and how this is a bridge from school to society. But then I'm going to write about other functions, because it says the main one here on my negative side, and say that there are other more important functions that the education system plays. And again, I'm going to write about role allocation, and I'm going to write about social cohesion as being my other 2. Okay, so let's start by defining what's going on in this essay here. So the education system has several functions . However, there's other functions such as role allocation and social cohesion are more, and it's gone for main. I'm going to go for significant. I could have gone for important. I'll try and use the word of the question if I can. Okay, what other key terms can I include in my answer while I'm writing about Parsons? So maybe I could try and write about particular and universal standards. Let's get some ideas going. I could write maybe about primary and secondary socialisation as being relevant. I'm going to write about role allocation. I could mention the hidden curriculum again. Some of the old favourites that I always write about in my education essays. Definitely going to want to write about meritocracy at some point. Okay, so those are my key terms, and I'll go through them as I go. Let's see how I get on. Which prepares us for working in the economy as okay. I want to give the other side, though, about the negative side of being prepared for work in this way. I'm going to write about Bowles and Gintis's correspondence principle. Notice how what I'm really doing here is arguing whether this is a positive or a negative. I've already given my detailed factual analysis. Now it's very much creating an argument. I put role allocation here as a negative. I suppose it could be a positive because it's also serving the economy, but I'm going to write about how it serves the needs of society as a whole. Okay, let's just check. I've mentioned particular universal, primary and secondary socialisation, hidden curriculum, now meritocracy. Benefits the economy. Oh, I've gone off the screen here. Though the meritocracy benefits the economy, so it is serving the needs of the economy. I'm now going to write out actually the main aim is to serve society. I'm running out of time, but I'm going to try and make sure I still write about social cohesion. Onto my next page. So although the education system does benefit the economy, this is not its main function, which was the question. Its main function is to support society by ensuring social cohesion, and that the most able do the most functionally important jobs, even whether or not this benefits the economy. And I am just under my 12 minutes for that question as well. I've repeated myself a couple of times, but there's no harm in that as long as I've got the key points down in under my time. Okay, now going to move to the next section, 4-mark sections. Here I get an item followed by 2 questions about it. So I'm going to read the item first, and then I'm going to have a go at those 2 questions in order. So I'll do question 8 followed by question 9. And I'm going to read the question before I read the item. And I'm into my time now for this question. I've got 4 minutes before I should have got to the end of that question. So, from item B, identify and describe the research method used by Willis. So I'm looking for that research method, including what you know of his perspective on education. Note it's got 2 parts. One is to identify and describe the research method. The other is what I know of his perspective. So let's read through. He observed a group of working class students. I remember this. Wanted to leave school as soon as they could. These are the lads, and they had different values to the conformist ear-rolls, the ones who obeyed the teacher. And it says here some of the bad things they did, making animal shapes on the screen. Haven't come across a research method yet. He's clearly watching them. continuous scraping of chairs, bad-tempered tutting, continuous fidgeting. Here we go. Willis used both participant and non-participant observations in class in order to experience them. So I found it, I have to identify it and describe it. So that's a paragraph there of explanation. That's what describe means. So Willis used non-participant observations where the researcher and records the different types of events that occur collecting objective data. For example, he could have recorded how often the lads refused to obey an instruction. He also used participant observation where he embedded himself in the situation, e.g. taking part in a class, including what you know of his perspective on education. Well, this is just testing my knowledge. I know that Willis was a Marxist, and that's literally what they're doing. There's 3 marks for a paragraph, an identify and describe paragraph. The 4th mark is simply for knowing Willis wrote from a Marxist perspective. I could literally have written Willis was a Marxist and I would have got that mark. I don't need to explain that. Just ask me what I know of his perspective. I know he was a Marxist. It doesn't ask me to explain what that means, what perspective he was coming from. Okay, so there's my 4th mark. 3 marks for identifying the research method and being able to explain it, and that's what I've done, given an example. 1 mark simply for knowing that he wrote from a Marxist perspective. Okay, I've done that in under my 4 minutes. Maybe I read through this slightly more quickly. Might usually take a little bit more time. I was familiar with Paul Willis there, but if you're unfamiliar, it might take you a little bit more time, but you should still be able to get that answer written in under the 4 minutes. Okay, as long as you have in your revision remembered what each type of research method is. Move on to my next question. And it says here, identify one function of education as identified by functionalists and explain how you would investigate this using unstructured interviews. Notice I'm identifying one function here and I'm explaining the research method. So that is absolutely crucial. I'm going to focus on social cohesion. Why not? Now, I'm not going to write one function of education is social cohesion, or functionalists have identified many functions of education, one of which is social cohesion. I'm just going to go straight in, ask me to identify it, and I'm going to put it here. Social cohesion is binding society together, set of norms and values through the hidden and formal curriculum studied in education. For example, learning to work together in a team in PE, or learning about different religions in RE. Okay, took me a minute from when I started having read the question. So there's the first half of the question done. How would I investigate it using unstructured interviews? I could investigate this. So let's make it in the 3rd person. This could be investigated by asking some young children a series of questions in a free-flowing conversation. There we go. So I've explained what an unstructured interview is. Questions where they are asked about how they feel about school and society, see if they have learnt, loyal to their community and to one another, e.g. asking them if they should work together with anyone if the teacher asks them. So notice I have explained what an unstructured interview is, and I've given an example of how I could use it to ask about social cohesion. And I've said here what social cohesion was. I gave examples there as well. Perhaps I didn't need to because it just said identify one function of education, but I had the time, I had the idea, so I put it in as well. But even if I hadn't, if I had just simply identified my one function and I'd explained, then I would have been able to do it. And again, notice this bit I just kind of did off the top of my head, but in my revision I'd made sure I'd memorised what an unstructured interview was. A series of questions in a free-flowing conversation. Didn't ask me for the advantages and disadvantages of unstructured interviews, so I didn't write about them. Okay, going to move on to the next page now. Again, look how I get an item and a series of questions about it. So I'm not going to go reverse work my way back through. I'm going to go to the item and then do those questions in order. And the first question says, examine one weakness in the research. So let's have a read through. Maybe a bit slower this time to make sure we're all following. Sociologists are concerned about the poor performance of working class pupils. According to a study by the Universities of Leicester and Leeds, middle class pupils do better. Parents put more effort into their education. The researchers suggested the policies just improving parental effort could be effective. So I'm not going to do the research method yet, but this might be useful for the other questions. So let's just remember this is about parents putting in more effort. Effort was measured using indicators. Now I'm into the research method, aren't I? Indicators of student attitude, such as the answers given by 16-year-olds to questions. So I've got some kind of questionnaire or interview happening here. Do they think school's a waste of time? Teachers' views, so teachers are asked as well. Other factors studied with the parents' interest, for example, whether they read. The research must try harder use the National Child Development Study, which follows individuals, look at this, born in a given week in 1958 throughout their lives. It was a longitudinal study, okay? And I'm asked for one weakness of the research. So let's put this, the National Child Development Study is a longitudinal study. These are, this is where I've used my knowledge again, expensive and time consuming, and participants can drop out. So there we go. So, and then must try harder. So let's link this to the thing. Must try harder. May not have therefore had a representative sample. It's the problem if people drop out. How do you know that your sample is representative? So I've used a nice key term there. Given a weakness, I've linked it to the item. There's my 2 marks. Slightly over my 2 minutes, but that's okay because I took a lot of the time reading through again. Again, maybe it would take you slightly more time to read through. Do I have enough time then to move on to this? Here we go. Identify and explain. So I'm finding it and explaining it. A whole paragraph this time. One other factor that may have led to the relatively poor performance of working class pupils. So if I remember back, the item identified parents putting in more effort as being one indicator of whether they were doing well. This now asks me for another factor. I'm going to choose to write about material deprivation. And again, I'm not going to write one other factor that could lead to, I'm just going to write material deprivation. Put my point in at the beginning. Material deprivation can also affect the performance of working class pupils. And now I need to explain it with an example. So let's do that. Let's put in the wording of the question. They perform poorly relative to their peers. You'll notice several times I've stopped, crossed something out. This is an exam. They don't expect perfectly neat writing all the time. You just need to make sure you get the answers down. There's my identify and explain. That's going to be worth 3 marks. It's a 4-mark question. And it specifically says referred to as a concern in item A. And in item A, they were specifically referred to the poor performance of working class pupils relative to their peers, okay, according to the study. So let's link that here. And in fact, they specifically said parents putting in more effort, such as reading to their child. So let's include that, okay? They have affected Okay, so I've written, they asked me for a factor, I've given material deprivation, I've explained it, I've given an example, but I've also made a specific link to something specifically mentioned in the item. And that is why it's a 4-mark question rather than a 3-mark question. I've still managed to do all of that in under my 4 minutes, so now I'm good for timing, and when that hits 38 minutes, I should be ready to move on to my next question. And here we go, identify and explain. So again, I'm going to have a paragraph on whatever this first thing is, 1 limitation of using questionnaires. So before I even read it, I know there's a 3 marks. Look, identify and explain 1 limitation of using questionnaires, which I need to know. I'm then going to investigate the literacy skills of parents. In other words, I'm going to use something about the literacy skills of parents in my example for why questionnaires are not good. Okay? And again, I'm not going to start with what questionnaires are, 1 limitation of questionnaires is. I'm going to get straight to the limitation. Those are not valid. And again, this is simply something I know from my revision, from my knowledge. And look how often knowing my research methods has been crucial for this question. Let's link to the literacy skills of parents, and they've been discussing reading here, so let's move on to reading. And I use the word quality just so I can set me up to use another couple of key terms here. Okay. Literacy isn't just about numbers, it's also about how good you are at reading and writing. I've got a minute still to go. Have I given enough here about the literacy skills? I've mentioned reading, maybe writing as well, so maybe I could put something about that in too. Again, if I ask them about how good they are at writing, maybe they can record the level of education. It's going to be a closed question, isn't it, with some closed answers. But that's not really a good measure of quality. Put a couple of examples in there because I had time. Hopefully there's enough there. The examiner will be impressed. But most importantly, I did identify and explain a limitation and I backed it up with an example. So I should be good to get my full marks. Reading and answering the 3 questions in this section. I had 10 minutes to do all of it. Took me a bit of time to read it, so I was a bit behind then, but then by the time I've gone through, I'm actually ahead of time again. Got to move now to the first section here. Now there's no item here, so it doesn't really matter what order I'll do them. I'm going to do the big questions first again, and here we go, describe the hidden curriculum in education. And I'm now straight into just a short paragraph where I explain something and I give an example. So, the hidden curriculum. Again, here's my knowledge. Have I learned what it is? Hopefully I've memorised the definition. Okay, taking out quite a few lines there. Might actually been able to do that in fewer words. Remember, you don't have to use all of the space. I've defined what the hidden curriculum is. I've compared it to the formal curriculum. I've given examples and I've explained the significance of that. The fewer words you can do it, the better. And I can do that in under 3 minutes if I know what I've done. So again, I'm ahead of time. Let's look at this next one. Identify and describe one example of cultural capital. Notice that they haven't asked me to define cultural capital, just to identify and describe one example. And they're even telling me cultural capital is things that middle class parents can use to give their children advantages at school. So what could I write about? Well, let's write about, I don't know, going to museums when you're on holiday, something like that. Okay, so middle. Again, I don't have to write one example of cultural capital is. Try and use sociological language rather than writing do better. I've put attain high. You may have noticed that earlier. I was writing about high educational attainment rather than just doing well. And again, it's probably enough, but I've got time to do more if I want, because I knew the answer when they asked me and I'd done my revision. Okay, so parents can use to go to advantages at school. I've mentioned a couple of advantages that they have gained from my example, which was taking their children to museums on holiday. Again, I think I've got my 3 marks there. Now I've only got these short ones to go. Which term is commonly used by sociology to describe the academic subjects taught in school? Again, this just comes down to knowledge. First time I read it, I'm not quite sure what it means, but then I see formal curriculum or hidden curriculum. Formal curriculum is what's taught in academic subjects. Hidden curriculum is everything else we were describing earlier. Optional curriculum, don't know what that is. Vocational curriculum, that's about subjects that have coursework and prepare you for jobs rather than exams. It's definitely the formal curriculum. Which term is commonly used to describe a school that does not select pupils on the basis of ability? Now look at the key word there, not select pupils. There are a number of different types of schools that do. Grammar schools, independent schools, private schools is another word for independent school, that's mentioned there. An academy, well, an academy is just one that's opted out of being controlled by the local authority, but is still funded by the state, by the taxpayer. Parents don't pay to go. That might be selective or not selective. Comprehensive schools, they are the ones that are selective. Notice how I was working perfectly to time all the way through until I got to the final section. The final section is worth 8 marks, but did not take me 8 minutes. Look, I've done it in just 5.5 minutes, because if you know these, knowing it doesn't take a minute to do. So that's why I started at the back, because if I'm going to be short of time, these are the ones that I can do ahead of time, in less time than I'm allocated if I need to. Okay, if I've only got 20 seconds to go at the end, I could still have a go at those if I read it and if I know it. All right. One disadvantage of doing it the way I did is that these early questions do give you some ideas for the later questions. Okay, by having read this, the formal curriculum and the hidden curriculum, I might have forgotten those terms before I did my exam, but the fact that I've read them here, or the hidden curriculum there, or cultural capital there, I could have used those key terms later in my answers. Okay, so there might be an advantage in looking at these questions first to get an idea, or if you've got time at the end, like I have, I used hidden curriculum in my answer. I never mentioned cultural capital in my answer. Perhaps I could have put that in one of my essays later. I mentioned something here in independent schools, didn't I, about them helping middle class parents? Look, those getting the good grades are only those more able from upper or middle class backgrounds. Okay, why don't I put in an extra thing here? Again, it doesn't matter how scruffy my answer is, the examiner knows I'm doing this in exam conditions. I already put a star there, look, didn't I? Let's have another one here. And let's put in an extra point as well, mentioning cultural capital. Additionally, upper and middle class children may have more cultural capital, like having been to, or I'd like to be more formal, such as having been to museums, making them more likely to pass the entrance exam. I've got 15 seconds to an independent school. So that time at the end for checking your work, you can use it to check spellings, you can use it to go back to a question you've missed, you can use it to read over, make sure everything makes sense, or if you have the time, you can use it to take an idea from the beginning of the paper and add it to your essay. 50 minutes then, and I have done one section of a paper. I'd now stretch out my fingers, I'd have 15 minutes to do another section of a paper, and then I'd still have 5 minutes to spare to go back to any questions I couldn't do or to check my spelling or anything else. But hopefully my spelling is good. I really want to be going back and checking it, wanted to have got it right first time. Okay, so there we go. I had 50 minutes. I did all the questions. It's worth 50 marks. My 1 mark questions are right. My 3 mark questions I've described and explained with examples, so I've got full marks there. My 2 mark question, I identified a weakness and I linked it to the item. My 4 mark question here, identified and explain. I had my paragraph, I linked it to my item. Identify and explain 1 limitation of questionnaires. I've got my paragraph on my limitation of questionnaires, which is they're not valid. To investigate literacy skills of parents, I mentioned literacy skills in my example. Did I identify and describe the research method used by Willis? Yes, I did in my paragraph. An extra mark for knowing his perspective. If I didn't know that perspective, I could still have got 3 out of 4. So don't worry about the phrasing of that question. Look at the first half of the question, answer it. If it's identify and describe or identify and explain, you can get 3 marks just by doing the first bit. But I happen to have the knowledge for the last bit. This one a bit trickier. Identify the function and then explain how I would use it. Okay, so I had to put the function first, which I had here, and then this also needed to be explained, but I've done that as well. And then my 2 essays. And in each essay, yes, I've got for and against. Okay, so here I've got my point 4 saying that the main function of the education system is to support the economy, with 2 arguments against. I did the same, of course, in my other essay as well, 1 for, 2 against. But crucially, I've also created an argument. Having given my 4, I then argued against it, however, before moving on to my 2 points for the other side. I did the same in this essay as well. Having given my point 4, I then had an however to counter-argue it, and then I had my 2 paragraphs for the opposite side. Meaning that when I came to my conclusion, I wasn't just picking a side, it was already clear all the way through my essay. There was a point for one side, but I gave a counter-argument, and then the points for my side. So the examiner knows what my conclusion is going to be by the time I get there, because I've argued all the way through the essay. The same here as well. Having done my however, it's easy what I'm going to get to. In fact, the examiner definitely knows what my argument is going to be, because I mentioned it at the beginning. The first thing I did when I wrote my essays, I defined the key terms, I defined what the question was, and I gave what my answer was going to be. I didn't start, remember, by working out what was going to be on each side. I started by defining the question and defining my answer, and then I wrote an essay to back it up. I did the same here. Defined what independent schools were, and then gave my answer. So how good are my essays? Well, you saw me write them. I put loads of key terms in. Okay, I made sure I gave examples for both sides. But most importantly, have I argued for a clear viewpoint? Yes, I have. And that is why my essays are going to be worth the top marks. So, these exams do rely on your knowledge. You saw all the way through. I had to have knowledge. Mostly, the knowledge I required was knowing my research methods, knowing advantages or limitations of them, using words such as valid and representative or maybe reliable, knowing lots and lots of key terms that I could include all the way through, including specifically the most useful thing for me were the functions of education. But it's not just about the knowledge. You've also got to have the exam technique. And hopefully you've seen in this video how to use the right exam technique in order so that you too can get 50 out of 50 on any section of the paper. Good luck in your own exam technique and doing well in your own exams.